For those of you who are joining us on YouTube once again. I have uh, I have definitely been enriched by the constant feedback that I get from people who watch us on YouTube. So that's been awesome. Not a whole lot of comments, but I do get texts and emails and things like that, letting me know that this is a good thing. Okay, so um, let's talk a minute about last week. So first of all, from Shabbat or from sundown Saturday night to now, I would say that we have definitely experienced in some form the golden calf season. But what I want to make clear is this is also the feast day season. And in addition to that, I want to make clear that this is also the Shabbat season. And I want to make clear that it is also the Torah cycle. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that there is a connection between the seasons and a connection that has to do with how the supernatural occurs in those seasons. And I think when we get to the nitty gritty of this, it's going to be a pretty exciting message. So let's talk about this. So first of all, let me just go ahead and I'll put some things on the board. First things first, right? Okay, so let's switch back over to the board, not the browser, the board. There we go. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. So if we were to just kind of recap a little bit here, let's make our fat pin green because I like that color for the 3 dots. And let's make my finger yellow. And let's make this fine pin blue. Okay, here we go. So here's a dot, here's a dot, here's a dot. Everybody knows where this is going, right? Everybody knows by now, most people know this is Passover, right? This is Pentecost. This is Tabernacles. Okay. Now, in between here and here is a timeline, a linear timeline. Let's talk a minute about linear versus cyclical timelines as a recap. Okay. Linear versus cyclical. So a linear timeline is actually a timeline that follows the function of the sun, moon, and stars. And when I say the function, nowhere in scripture does it says that they were pretty to look at. It says they're for signs, season, years, and days. Well, we know that our solar day is calculated from sun up to sundown, but our actual true day is calculated as a 24-hour period. So the interesting thing there is that we have a perceived day and then we have a legitimate day, and that legitimate day is based upon a rotation, and that rotation after 365, or actually it's like 364.90001 days equates to a full year. Okay. Now, Hebrews didn't really articulate time that way. They more kind of looked in terms of the cycle of the moon, which is the cyclical time. Okay. And let me explain what I mean by cyclical is that there was no other way to govern a 1 month period except the moon. Okay. And Yahweh would say, well, in the 7th month, do this. And so they would have to watch the moon. Nowhere in there does it really talk about days unless you count the days of a feast time period or a moedim, okay, or a moed. Now, the reason why that's so important is because then we start to get into finite seasons moving into infinite seasons, but that might be a little bit too much. Regardless, what I want to show you is how this works in terms of attraction and how this works in terms of disattraction. Okay. And if you think that it's arrogant to form neologisms, talk to Einstein because he did it all the time. Neologisms are words that don't exist and people use them just to prove a point, right? So sometimes I come up with things like disattraction. Okay, so the premise is that when we're working with the feast days, one of the things that we look at is the pattern of Israel, right? The cycle of Israel. So let's just really, really quick recap that as well, because I think that's going to be important here. So recall that there is actually a cycle, and I'm going to put it over here for a reason, right? And this cycle has 4 points to it, right? That we've talked about before. We have a side that is obedience. Right? And we have a side that is disobedience. Okay. And on the side of, so we can just cut that in a quadrant. Well, then we have what is kind of called a integration and disintegration, right? So this is a disintegration from obedience, disintegration. And this is an integration into disobedience. Okay, this is a disintegration into obedience. And this is an integration into. Okay, now what's important is that this is kind of a time of death. This is a time of resurrection. Actually, this point is resurrection. Well, so, okay, let's do it this way. Resurrection. This is a time of maturity. And this is a time of introspection. Okay. So, okay. So what's going on here? What is this integration into disobedience? Well, it usually comes with an infestation. I'm gonna go ahead and change the color here to something a little bit more, yeah, let's do it that way. Let's do, and so this is gonna be infest. Okay, infest. And the whole idea behind infestation, in fact, we'll just write the whole thing, infestation, is that there is an allowable negative process to exist within the realm of the people. Okay. This eventually gets to oppression. Okay. And then this eventually gets to possession. Now, recall that there is kind of a context here of demonic dominion, okay? Or demonic, let's call it demonic rulership, which will always require bloodshed. Okay, so now at this point here, and please understand, infestation kind of is this whole season, okay? Oppression is kind of this whole season, right? But possession results in an almost immediate crying out. Let's change the color there too. I want crying out to be very distinct from the infestation, possession, etc. Okay, so we're going to jump over to, let's see, let's use magenta for this. Cry out. Okay. The cry out results in an agent being sent, right, to you to rally you to what? To deliver yourself. Let's talk a minute about that. Because this is important, okay? Israel, every single time in the book of Judges that they became possessed by a nation, when they were completely sold over to that nation and became a possession of that nation, cried out to God, he would send a judge. The judge would rally the army and Israel would deliver themselves. Okay? Israel would deliver themselves. So, and I want you to understand, when we're watching the cycle of Israel, this is important. Okay, so now we have in this same function of this wheel, we have, let's see, let's go back to our labeling. And let's just use this darker green for the fine pen and say this is winter. This is spring. This is summer. And this is fall. Okay. Now, there's some things that are very important, obviously, and we'll just go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and put in here entropy, because there's a breaking down or a disintegration coming. Okay. So the threshold from winter to spring is a death theme. Okay. And that death theme is going to be given to the entire world as a process of their seasons. Everything during winter dies, right? Spring is a resurrection theme. Everything comes back to life, right? So there's a death, season of death. Okay. There is a season of resurrection. I'm just going to put season here because we're going to have to use this side over here in a minute. Season of resurrection. And then there's a season of growth. Okay. That is related to this. And so this is growth. Okay. And then there is a season of there's a season of breaking down or entropy, right? And I'm just going to write season here because I know we're getting bogged down in our board real quick. So now here's the deal. This is the function of the sun shines on the just and the unjust, right? This is not the blessed. This is not the cursed. There is a cycle of the cursed that we've never talked about. but there is also a cycle of the blessed. And so I'm just going to go ahead and map that out real quick, to offer the same process, but in a different way. Because remember that the seed, and we'll call this the cycle of the blessed, okay? Cycle of the blessed. That blessed. Okay. All right. And so there's a very different thing going on here. There is still going to be cycles and seasons, right? So what is this? What is the season in wintertime of what is the season of wintertime in the cycle of the blessed? It is the season of sowing, right? And waiting. The rest of, so this is just that single area of season. The rest of the season is all about reaping, but then we have this ebb and flow that's occurring, okay? And so instead of integration, disintegration, we've got a time in which you are going to be in a state of fatness, right? Because that's part of the test. You see, this is actually the test too. And so this is kind of a testing season. Okay. And during that testing season, there will be fatness, not necessarily financial abundance. I know people kind of distort my words and think that that's true, that, hey, during the golden calf season, you're going to have a bunch of money. No, that's not true. But there will be such a satiation in areas of your life that are needed to be satiated that you will grow fat, and you will get you will kick against the instruction. Okay. Okay, so this is a season of testing, and I know I wrote that over spring, and so you can't really read that that's testing, but that's okay. We're gonna keep going here. So the premise is, when we are going through this, there seems to be choice, but that choice also is somewhat determinate. Okay, deterministic. So let's talk about that for a minute. Although there are definite variations in the Septuagint and definite variations in the Masoretic texts and in the Aramaic texts concerning this verse, and I have to be cautious when I state this, Deuteronomy 32 says that the nations were numbered according to the sons of Israel. In other words, that there was a contingency of Israel as a function of process within the rest of creation, the rest of the people of the earth. Not necessarily do we call them heathen, but we will say that they are not Israel, because Israel is those who have entered into covenant with Yahweh. Okay. Now, there are some important things that we need to look at here, and that is that as these seasons occur, they're unavoidable. And what I mean by that is that they happen in such a way that we actually, no matter what, are pursued by their theme. You want my proof? Look at the seasons. Remember, this whole entire Torah cycle from Genesis until now, and now we are in Deuteronomy. We're almost back to Sukkot again and are going to roll the scroll again. And so why is that important? What is the relevance? The relevance is that we have gone through these times of resurrection and maturity, and we're now moving into the entropy, the breaking down. Now, notice I added something to the cycle that you've never seen before, unless you have been with me for a long time, and that's introspection. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later, but the premise is that there is actually a video somewhere in my archives that talks about the number 40 and explains how the 40 days of introspection correspond with the 40 days and 40 nights of the flood, correspond with the 40 days and 40 nights of Yeshua's fasting, correspond with Elijah's movement from where he was at to Mount Horeb, and correspond with Moses's time on the mountain. But we're not quite ready for that yet. Okay, there's kind of this in-between time between the 9th of Av, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the beginning of introspection. But I want to share with you this this premise that basically from the 9th of Av, which is supposed to be a time of mourning, sitting Sheva for a day anyways, even though that Sheva means 7, and also, the idea of all of the things that happened during the 9th of Av, which you can Google. Okay, I'm not going to go through the list, but there's some significant things that happened to the nation of Israel during the 9th of Av, which corresponds pretty close to the infestation part of the infestation part of the cycle of obedience and disobedience, or the cycle of Israel. The cycle of the blessed doesn't contain that, but it does contain a test. And that test is how you will deal with your abundance, what you will do with your abundance. Maybe I should call it the cycle of the abundance. I don't know. Anyways, and we may switch that up, but the 9th of Av is supposed to be this time of mourning and, not supposed to get married and reaction. And some people even fast. They don't drink water. Whatever the things are that are the elements of the 9th of Av for people, the premise is that it corresponds with the golden calf. And quite literally, it corresponds with the refusal by the people who came out of Egypt to enter Israel, and corresponds consequently to false images. Okay? Corresponds to falseness, corresponds to deceit. The people had to get to a point where they were lying to themselves. Okay? Remember last week I talked about a counterfeit. I talked about this middle aisle, not Jewish, not heathen religion that was called Christianity, that does not reflect the book of Acts and does not reflect the book of John. And in that process, it is very important for you to know that we also have some sort of supernatural theme occur during the 9th of Av. You can find some of that kind of stuff potentially in Jewish mystical commentary. But the premise is that the 9th of Av is this time of remembering the golden calf by disasters happening to the Jews, to the nation of Israel, to the Hebrews. Okay, and those are three distinct different things. One is the other, and one corresponds to the other, but they're not all the same. All right, so having said that, it is very important that we understand that the seasons pursue. Remember, Paul says, what has been made tells us about God's invisible. I know I'm quoting the English. God's invisible attributes, his divine nature, and his eternal power. Okay? Now, when we are dealing with those concepts, we need to understand that anything that has been made, like when we talked about transistors last week, can be studied and understood as some function of teaching us about God. Well, the seasons do something very intriguing, because I'm going to ask you a question. Can you resist winter? Now, for those of you in Florida, let me say this. Can you resist the stormy season? Can you resist the hurricane season, right? The seasons that happen in the place where you are at, can you stop them? Can you affect them? Can you change them? Can you hope that they don't happen? Or do you respond or react to them? Watch. You get up in the morning, you're getting ready to go to work, you haven't looked outside yet, you get your coffee, you do your thing, right? And all of a sudden it's time to go out and start the car, you open the door and there's 2 feet of snow, right? In, say, October, right? You're not expecting the snow, nobody thinks the snow's coming, and boom, you've got snow, right? Now what happens? Now you either react or you respond. If you react, you're like, okay, I'm calling in sick, right? Or you go out there angry, kicking the car, kicking the, and I'm telling you, I've had my experiences of having to use my ID with a bare hand, scraping ice off the windshield because I didn't have an ice scraper yet, and God knows where the other one went. Or do you respond, right? And maybe you respond, you go out there and you brush off the snow and you turn on the defroster, and now you're going to probably be 15-minute late, but everybody's going to be 15 minutes late, so that's okay too, right? And you get ready for the fact that you're going to have to drive on snow. Maybe you didn't get your snow tires yet. You're going to drive on snow with a rear-wheel drive vehicle, right? You get my point here. Now, I know you Floridites don't experience that, right? It doesn't happen that way in the South as much. And if you do get something like that, it's anomalous enough that it becomes a horrible experience. But can you stop it? No. You can react to it or you can respond to it. Now, in that way, as we are looking at linear time, and remember, I drew my line straight. I didn't draw my sine curves yet, right? You haven't seen my sine curves. You haven't seen the ebb and flow of the seasons in the feast day season. I left it linear because we're working on that solar 365-day year, and we're working on that lunar 28 point blah, blah, blah month. And we're working on that 23.99 something hour day, okay? Which we've rounded off to 30, 24, and 360. Anyway, so point being is that's linear time. How is that linear time? And it's kind of a deception, but it's okay. It's not like we are ever going to let that go, right? We count our years by the sun up, sundown for 365 years. And then boom, next thing you know, it's our birthday again. But the truth is we may be more mature or less mature than those years actually process, both in body and in mind. But as we are going through our summer years, and I'm just going to use my location, there's a point in time where it gets extremely hot. And then right after that hot, all of a sudden we start to have these really cloudy afternoons. And what do I know? I know the monsoon season is coming. And when the monsoon season comes, I know the next thing that's going to happen is it's going to be cold. It's going to get cold. And it just happens that way. Here's the intrigue. The rainbow says, right? What does the rainbow say? The rainbow says that everyone is diverse. Nope, that's not what the rainbow says. The rainbow says that seed time and harvest, summer and winter will, or cold and heat will not cease as long as that rainbow is in the sky. And so as a result of that, then if that's what the rainbow says, and we still see a rainbow, then what can you kind of bank on? That winter is going to pursue fall, and fall is going to pursue autumn, and autumn is going to pursue spring. You say pursue? Yes, it's going to catch up to and overtake spring. Okay? Now, I know we don't think that way because in our minds, whether we are atheist, whether we are a pantheistic worshiper, a monotheistic worshiper, or some spiritual person who doesn't believe completely in any one thing, agnostic or something like that, we bank. We bank on our seasons, right? Farmers bank on their season. Everybody knows what's going to happen on December 25th in this entire world. And one of the things that accompanies that time period is a warm weather dressed individual, right? With a Frisian cap, right? And nice red fluffy stuff, white fluffy stuff going down his coat. Why? Because it's winter time, right? We bank on that. We think in those terms. For example, our blessed DIY stores have already begun inundating us with what? Halloween stuff, because we're banking on that season. But what we don't realize is the theme pursues us too. What does the rainy season tell me to do? Probably need to make sure that I'm stocked up on pants because it's shorts weather's going away soon, right? Probably need to make sure all my coats are clean and not nasty smelling like they did from when, it was winter last year. Because why? Because the seasons are coming and you can bank on their theme. So now, if we were to take that information based upon these cycles and go back to our linear time and look at the curves, which we will look at now, then you would find that there is something interesting occurring. So let's talk a minute about Passover. Passover has somebody or something coming in at this angle. And Passover has somebody or something coming in at this angle. And what are they? Well, this one, and actually, you know what? We're going to go ahead and we're going to illustrate these with two different colors. My fat pen. So let's see, we're going to do fat pen and we'll do, let's do magenta for the physical realm, and we'll do a different color for the other realm. So now coming in from this direction and then coming down and then going up and then coming down is what? A manifestation or a materialization from nothing of seasons. Materialization from nothing. What are you talking about, Q? Well, here's the deal. Each one of these points has some sort of theme, just like the seasons. Okay? So, for example, Passover happens in the spring and it has pursued winter. So, let's talk a minute about this. If death is the theme of winter, then spring pursuing winter means the resurrection is pursuing death. Okay? Remember, Paul said we can learn from the things that have been made. And so what we need to see is that there's a deterministic or sovereign element to the theme of the feast, which means what? We are not immune. The world is not immune. Because when you figure out who Israel is, you realize that when it says in Exodus chapter 12, the same rule applies to those who are foreign among you and those who dwell among you who are not Israel. Israel's everywhere in the world right now. And so the themes of the feast days pursue the world as well. And we're going to get into that. Okay, so the next, and listen, this is just to help you learn the law of pursuit. Okay, the law of pursuit. And it has something to do with the Avenger of Blood and some other things too, but we may or may not get into those today. Okay, so the premise is that there is a pursuit, and it will chase you down and manifest itself if you are trying to run from it. So, for example, if we're looking at Passover, what do we know about Passover? Passover is the manifestation of the resurrection. The 14th of Nisan is when we celebrate Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection. Now, on the Feast of First Fruits is when he rose, right? Which happens at what? Saturday sundown. No, that's not when he rose. That's when he presented himself to the two Marys. But he had already risen, which means he rose before sundown, which means what? He rose on Saturday. Okay, that's enough about that. But the point is that as we pursue that Feast of First Fruits, or I'm sorry, as that Feast of First Fruits comes into existence in that present time period, that's when we acknowledge the resurrection. But the Passover season is Passover, unleavened bread, and Bikurim, first fruits. And that also contains the firstborn element as well, which we can talk about sometime, but not today. So the premise is the Passover season contains the spring feasts. The Passover is a mandatory feast. Pentecost is a mandatory feast. And Tabernacles is a mandatory feast where we make ourselves present in the place where Yahweh will put his name. That's what the commandment says, not Jerusalem, where Yahweh will put his name. And in that place is where we will have our what? Mandatory feast, in which we'd show up what? Not empty-handed, prepared to either a purchase, or we have brought, because we live close, brought the sacrifice that we're going to eat. You may eat the sacrifice in the place where I put my name during these mandatory feasts. In fact, it's actually a commandment to save 10% of your income for yourself for those feast days. And then I will add in there that there is a premise that you are also supposed to make sure that the poor have theirs, right? So the people who can't afford to wine and dine during these feast days, which is a bad interpretation of that word moed, these appointed times. Now, what does that mean, appointed times? Appointed times means it is a sovereign operation that we cannot stop, right? Appointed times means there's a plan. Appointed times means there's sovereignty. There is determinism. Is there absolute determinism like in 5-point Calvinism? No. But there is absolute sovereignty within that determinism. He wants us to join him with a free will choice in the process of creation. That's why he gave us deliberate creation and dominion, the obedience of the universe to our deliberate imaginations of the future, which is a whole nother discussion, which we won't get into. But the premise is that those appointed times means then that they pursue themselves. So in that way, the way you want to think about this is that Pentecost pursues Passover. And what do I mean by that? You can't stop it. It will catch up to you. How many people would agree that there's times where the feast days have snuck up on you because of life's cares and worries, right? Okay, so now the premise is that the Passover pursued something else. What did the Passover pursue? This winter season, the season or the non-feast day season, or the non-Moedim. That space in between Sukkot and Passover. So what do we know? We know that Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, is a season in and of itself that starts at the 8th day of the feast. And that season goes all the way until Passover, which means what? Passover pursues Sukkot. Okay, and so why is that important? Because there's themes present in these seasons that, just like wintertime, demonstrate that something is coming. And if you're prepared for it or you understand it, then there's a function to it, right? So let's talk about this. This is that moment where God brought us out into the wilderness to die, right? And then right after it is the manna, which starts to create that fatness, which eventually arrives at this trend towards what? The golden calf. And as we move through the golden calf season from here to here, it's been nothing but fatness and complaining and attitude, and I don't want to do this, and I don't like this anymore. This is monotonous now, and it doesn't have its same pizzazz. And then, boom, right after the golden calf, all of a sudden, humility hits and gratefulness hits and all these things hit. It will pursue you. The golden calf will pursue you. And the way that it pursues you is it starts here at Pentecost, where all of a sudden, for whatever reason, you don't have the same attitude of lack and decrease and of deficit, but have all of these things satisfied. And so you kind of go into this state of either gloating, or you go into this state of complacency and are like, man, we still have to eat this manna. Like, we've been eating this manna for years, right? When us who come later read that, we go, I want manna, right? But the truth is if we had to eat it for a number of years, we might go, all we have to eat is this manna, right? Okay. So the premise is that this wilderness season, in which there is a sense of lack and decrease, is accompanied by a pursuit of that feeling. So you don't complain because it's boring. You complain because you don't have enough. And this one, you complain because you have enough and it's boring. Okay? Isn't it ironic that this is the summer season right here? And it's interesting because the way there was given a tool to take care of the wilderness season called what? Omer, we go into the wilderness season. We go into that part of the Passover season. Remember, the wilderness season is within the Passover season. We go into that season with the understanding that we are what? We are going to look at the attributes of God and admire them in ourselves by acting them out. For example, it'll say something like it'll say, today is the energy of judgment within mercy. What does that mean? That means that mercy actually has kind of a balancing element that there needs to be judgment. And the way you do that is you ask yourself, where have I given myself too much grace? Right? And that day becomes a meditation upon that, and you move through the wilderness season in a lot of ways distracted from the lack and decrease that's occurring, which is what? Reaping what you've sown, right? Reaping what you've sown. If you've sown, listen, let me explain something to you. If you've sown something at Yom Kippur, it's determined whether or not you have repented of it. Then at Yom Kippur, they say, okay, next year at that time where they sowed that, we're either going to create a judgment, which would be an actual receiving of lack and decrease, or we're going to create a temptation. If you overcome the temptation, then you move into the cycle of obedience, or I'm sorry, the cycle of abundance because you chose to be obedient. But the premise is that as we go through that thought process, we now are being activated within those themes with a tool. So is there a tool for the golden calf season? Yes, we've talked about it. What is it? Distribution and gratefulness. Okay, now, at the same time that this is occurring in the physical realm, we're watching this lack and decrease, fear, scarcity mentality stuff to this fatness and boredom and complacency. And they're all leading into the fall feasts, right? Leading out of the summertime, which means what? Tabernacle pursues Pentecost, which means what? What's coming? We know the marriage supper of the Lamb is coming. We know that the consummation is coming. We know that the ratification of the covenant is coming, right? The change in status is coming from what? Willful woman to bride. Remember that transition from willful woman to bound to bride, right? Okay. Again, recaps that we can't get into or we'd be chasing rabbit trails all day long. And you could see that there's so many recaps that need to occur. I need to stick with the relevant ones. Okay. So what I want you to understand is that Omer is actually the tool provided, all right? But then there is another element, and that is that there is this idea of it leading into that provision, leading into complacency, where in which we need to respond with distribution and gratefulness. What's the distribution? That's the parable of the 10 hamburgers that I've taught in the past, right? You go to a restaurant, or you go to a fast food joint, you come in and then they say, hey, you know what? Somebody just made an order for 10 hamburgers. I can't use them. Would you want them? I see you have a big family. Would you want them? So everybody eats some hamburgers and eventually we have maybe 6, 7 hamburgers left, right? And so now what are we going to do with the hamburgers? We're going to throw them away? No, we're going to go find somebody who's hungry and give them the hamburger, right? That's distribution. After you've had your fill, gratefulness, because what's gratefulness? Is gratefulness saying, oh, thank you for preparing that food? Listen, I'm going to share something with you where you can be very human, and nobody will ever know that you were human because you kept it in your head. You go to a relative's house, right? They do this big old to-do, barbecue, maybe something like that. You go to the relative's house and you walk in and you're like trying to have a American Christian concept of gratefulness. So you're like, oh, thank you for preparing this food. Oh, how can I help? Right? Oh, can I, what can I do? You sit down at the meal, and not only does it taste like things you've ran over in the street, but it also has the texture of something that's come up from your stomach before. And so you're like, right, you get feeding it to the dog or something. And you walk away and you sit down in the car and you're like, that was horrible. So, really, truly, in all honesty or in all truthfulness, what happened there? You were grateful before you ever received it, right? And then when you consumed it, it wasn't what you thought it was. So gratefulness is actually after you've consumed. Yahweh says, when you have consumed and given thanks, right? Okay. So that's kind of the difference between American Christian and Hebrew. The Hebrew gratefulness is the consumption itself. So you've already consumed yours, right? And you've consumed it with the understanding that it was provided. And now you're going to distribute. That's the answer to the golden calf. But what did the golden calf do? It pursued Pentecost. It was determined, which means when the world goes into this state, there is a change in attitude. There is a change in process. We're going to find out why here in a minute. But the premise is that Israel, the nations of the world were numbered according to Israel. In fact, let's go look at that verse. I believe it is Deuteronomy 32:28, but I'm not. I'm going to go ahead and say that we'll go find out, right? So let's we need to I need to plug this in. We're good. I got it. Deuteronomy chapter 32. I believe it is verse 28. Okay, so that's actually not the verse, but it is here in Deuteronomy 32, and it basically says that the world was created according to the number of the sons of Israel. But there's some verses in the Septuagint, I believe, and in the Aramaic that seem to indicate that it may not have read that way and that it was possibly an emendation of the scribes. But basically, and I'm not going to sit here and look for this while I'm doing this, but I wanted to at least share this verse with you. I'm almost positive it's 20. Let me change this over to NLT and see if it's just reading differently. So I think one of the parts that's important. Okay, here it is. In the Most High, causing nations to inherit in his. Oh, so it's not 28, it's 8. Okay, let's go back to the NLT. All right, so here we are. It is Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High assigned the lands to the nations, when he divided up the human race, he established the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of his heavenly court. And see, that's actually Masoretic text reads the sons of Israel. So if you go into the Hebrew, it says according to Bnei Yisrael, right? But if you go into the Septuagint, it says, according to the ungulon, which would be angels of God, okay? Or quote unquote, the heavenly court, which is just that's a not a good interpretation of those words, but in the Hebrew sons of Israel. So let's talk about that for a minute. The premise is that the entire world is a function of the sons of Israel. So I don't know how to explain this, because in its simplicity, there were no sons of Israel at the foundation of the earth. There were no sons of Israel during the time of the creation of the world. But after Jacob had his sons and they were numbered, and we don't know when that numbering occurred, if it was actually in the book of Numbers, but what we do know is then the boundaries of the earth were based upon that for the nations, right? Okay, so what I want to communicate is that what happens to Israel happens to the nations, right? The same Torah applies to the foreigner and the stranger living among you, okay? And so why is that important? Because now we're going to get into something really intriguing, and that is that these themes existed before Israel was a nation, and the practice of them appears in the Torah before Israel actually does the thing. Now, the intrigue there is that the wilderness season is a result of the wilderness. Okay? The Passover is a result of the Passover. The people of Israel had to go through that moment and experience that deliverance, and that eventually become a feast day for that season to activate. But it was determined from the foundations of the earth. Why? Because Yeshua was the lamb slain from the foundations of earth. When was he slain? At Passover. So Passover already existed. In fact, we can almost prove that Cain and Abel brought the Passover sacrifice and the first fruits sacrifice. But the premise is that however we look at it and whatever function we start to put into it, we can safely say that these things have been here from the beginning, even though that Israel had to go through them and experience them, just like Yeshua being slain from the foundations of the earth, but also arriving on the fourth day of creation, right? On the 4,000th year of creation, and being what? The perfect man who what? Was in all ways tempted but did not sin, and became sin for us that we might become the righteousness of God. So, why is that important? Because Torah is actually then already written at the foundations of the earth. So you would say, okay, that's awful deterministic. That means that what was written in Torah actually played out with the Israelites exactly the way that it was supposed to, in terms of, like, the Israelites did exactly what Torah said before they ever did. No. I didn't say the written Torah was written from the foundations of the earth. I said the Torah. You say, well, wait a minute. What about it? Isn't that the scroll being written from the? No. The scroll was written, and this is where it gets confusing. The scroll was written because of what happened. What happened because there was already a theme within a season written into time, and that was Torah, or what we would call the spirit of Torah. Okay? What do we know about Torah? Torah became flesh and dwelt among us. Well, that's interesting, because then what do we have? We have the word became flesh and dwelt among us. What else do we know? We have the word created things, right? John chapter 1, right? Through him all things were created, by him and for him. And without him nothing is held together, right? Okay. And or nothing exists. And I think it's in Colossians, it says all things are held together by him, right? And in him. Those are all very important. The reason why this is so important is because just because you have free will does not mean that you have free seasons. Seasons are promised, which means they're coming, which means you need to decide how you are going to be in them. Are you going to react to them? Are they going to sneak up on you? Or are you going to know exactly what's coming next? Right? So, and we know that they pursue each other. You know when winter's coming before winter comes. You know when spring's coming before spring comes. You know when summer's coming before summer comes. Not only because it's happened every year the same way for as long as you've been alive, but also because there's a sign, there seems to be a switch or a change in the seasons. And you're like, ooh, kind of cold out here on the porch. Bet you winter's coming, right? And that's the premise. I don't know how many times I've gone outside and taken a breath and said, "Oh my gosh, that smells like snow." That's snow coming. And anybody who's grown up in Colorado knows that smell, right? All right, or any of those states that have snow. But the premise is that basically we know. But what do we do when we know and we don't want it to be? We deceive ourselves. We trick ourselves into believing something that is not true. Okay? We say, no, it's not coming. It's not coming. You know, I love the people, the paraprofessional weather experts who can predict the weather according to their whim, right? They say, nah, it's going to be sunny that day. We ain't worried about it. They get to the lake, got the fishing poles out, and here comes the entire universe of rain upon that one specific lake. So that's lying to yourself, deceiving yourself, instead of just going with the flow that the next season is coming. Okay? All right. Why is that so important? Because you can fear it, you can dread it, you can be reactive to it, you can miss it, right? You can just flat out pretend like it didn't happen. I know I went the first maybe 3 years of my life in Torah with never celebrating Shavuot, never celebrating Pentecost. I didn't think it was important because Christianity had taught me that Pentecost doesn't exist. How did they teach me? By completely neglecting it in any of celebrations. It's been eliminated from Christian practice. Now, if you are in more of an Orthodox or Catholic mode, then it's very possible that there's some sort of acknowledgement of Pentecost. But generally speaking, American Christianity doesn't even know what it is. They know something happened in Acts. They know that it has something to do with the Spirit, and if you get caught up in in Arminius's doctrines, then eventually we arrive at some actual Pentecostal religious people. But the truth is they don't even celebrate the day. Okay, so I spent the first 3 years of my life. Not only would it sneak up on me, but pass me by, and I would be like, "Oh, Pentecost happened? Oh, I didn't even think about it." Right? Passover would come and boom, I mean, the world explodes with matzah discounts, right? But what happens at Pentecost? Nothing. What happens at Tabernacles? It depends on how Jewish you are, right? So what happens at Tabernacles with Christianity? Halloween. You say, "Oh, no, I don't celebrate Halloween because I'm a Christian." Well, guess what? If you go back to the traditional actions of Halloween, you will find that back in the 1800s, Christians celebrated Halloween. And if you're Catholic, you really celebrate it, but in a very different way. Okay, so why is all of this important? it is important because number one, you need to realize that something is pursuing you. Okay. The second thing you need to realize is how you're going to respond to it is important. So now we need to get into something else. Well, and the reason why we need to understand this is because of the power behind it. Okay? So let's take a look at this word. First of all, one of the things that we need to do is we need to illustrate some ancient nomadic Hebrew understandings on the board here. So starting at the beginning, let's just go ahead and let's draw some stuff. And then after I have illustrated some stuff, then we'll go ahead and get into the information. So first of all, let's just go with the simple tent here, okay? For a four-walled tent. In fact, I'm not going to do the hidden lines. We're not going to do that. We'll just make our door here and everybody knows it's a tent. Okay, and within that tent, we have what? We have the provision, protection, and instruction, correct? Provision, protection, and instruction. Provision, protection, and instruction. You know, we were on a vacation recently, and a camping trip, and when we got there, we got out one of the tents and we didn't have the poles for it. You know, there were some ways that we probably could have pitched that tent with some ropes tied to trees and stuff like that. But the truth is that the tent did not have its ability to function as a tent without the pole, okay? Or what we would call the strength of the tent. So in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we have a we have a man, I don't, how can I explain this? We have a symbol that looks like this, which generally was used on the pottery to kind of indicate the word tent, and it means tent, okay? And I know it doesn't look like a tent, and I know that it doesn't function in any way as a tent. I mean, some people have said, oh, well, this is the first part of the tent, and this is the inner sanctum of the tent. Okay, I'm not going to mess with it. I'm not going to try to analyze the symbol. This is the symbol for tent in ancient pictographic Hebrew on pottery shards found in the tells in Israel, but also in Mesopotamia and you know, places pertaining to the Middle East. Okay, like the Sumerian Empire. And so when we're using this, please understand that's representing tent. Now, the reason why that's important is because this right here is what? This is strong. And it is based upon what? The lead ox, right? Not only the ox that has the strength, but the ox that has the wisdom, okay? So when we are looking at this, we have the strength or the strong tent. What makes a tent strong is the structure, the skeleton of the tent. And here's the intrigue. The Hebrew word used for bones means strength. So the strength of the human is the bones, right? And when we lose our strength, it's that idea of not having any bones. And so we're just kind of this meat sack, right? Well, the premise is still true of a tent, right? Without the structure of the tent or the bones of the tent. And so what this is really talking about is what holds the tent up. Okay. Well, this is the word of, and it means Father. So the strength of the tent is the Father. The poles that hold the tent up, that make the tent a functional tent, is the Father. Okay. So that was important because that's where the provision, protection, and instruction is coming from. And we know a tent wall separates those who do not have provision, protection, and instruction from those who do, and also separates them from the elements, the cold and the heat. Okay. Now, the reason why that's important is because the Father is what causes the tent to stand. However, there's more. Okay. How many have had a tent and when they were using the tent, maybe they stuck a pole through wrong, or maybe they actually stepped on it wrong and it ripped or tore and it would no longer allow the poles to hold up the tent anymore. I've seen that occur. I don't think I've ever experienced it myself, where the tent was no longer usable because it had a rip in it and the poles didn't work because they slide through those slots in the tent. Okay, let's talk about that. So in ancient times, what they would do is they would take goat's hair and they would lay it over the structure, right, over the bones of the tent, and those skins would then become the outer layer that would become the protection. Well, it was wise to somehow cause those to be together. Well, when they first started learning, they would try to stitch those together, and what would happen? When the rain would come, it would go through the stitch holes and leak on the people. And so eventually they got their idea that they could seal those stitchings, right? So let's talk a minute about that. So we already have this concept or this idea of strong tent, okay? But when you have a liquid that's viscous and can create a seal that is glue, right? Well, the Hebrew word for glue is the drawing of the lead ox, which is what? The strength and wisdom, and the drawing for water. So we're going to say strong water. Now, why do we say strong water? Because what they would make is something called bone glue. So you take a pile of bones, you throw it in the water and you boil it for God knows how long, a long time. And this little film starts to appear at the top as the collagen begins to break down in the bones. And as the bones begin to start to kind of become soft and break down and the marrow is exposed, it becomes this very viscous material. You skim it off the top, you put it in a container and you mix it really good, and you use some sort of brush to brush it over the goat hair to seal the tent. Okay. And so in premise, the strong water or the glue that holds the tent together. where they would glue the panels over each other, layering them just like we do with shingles and tar today. Okay, so they're going to waterproof the tent through strong water. Well, this is the word. We're just going to put it this way. Aim. Okay. And the aim is the mother. Now, why is that important? Because provision, protection, and instruction come from the father. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say what comes from the mother, but you see that the provision, protection, and instruction has to come from the father. Because the bones of the tent or the strength of the tent is going to come from the father. Whereas the holding together of the tent itself, not the bones, not the structure, is going to be the mother. And in this way, a womb of maturity, growth, etc., is born, right? Okay, so that is an important point that needs to be made. But now you're going to find something out really, really amazing. And that is that when we go from strong water by itself, and I'm just going to do this, I'm going to do this way. We go strong water by itself, we're going to go aleph, okay? And then we're going to go mem. That's going to be the Hebrew name for mother. And then we're going to go final noon. So strong water continues. And this is the Hebrew word aman, or steadfastness. So we go from strong water to steadfastness through the parent root that also means mother. And what we are encountering is what? The strength to stand up straight and not be moved by the wind or whatever. And so this sometimes comes out as trunk. Okay. But then we have this word emuna, which is spelled like this. Emunah. Emunah is faith. And here's the intrigue. This is not faith as in thinking or believing a certain way. This is faith as in sacred or unwitnessed loyalty to the husband. Emunah is fidelity. When we talk about faith, we are basically going to say that we are banking upon a promise, right? That's the premise. So what is faith, emunah, in the Hebrew? It is the mother or the female being or banking upon the covenant or ketubah, okay? So the premise is that the man and the woman come to an agreement, and then the marriage is consummated. Now, there's all kinds of extra fluff added into that, where supposedly there has to be witnesses and there has to be a license and all this other stuff. But the truth is this is what it says. that a man shall leave his mother and father, be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That joining part is where we get into the question, what does that mean? What is that action, idea, whatever? That's another story and not for today. What we need to accept is that faith is banking upon the covenant. So what does that mean? That means that she trusts her husband, that her husband can go out and do the taming of the animals and the tending or the cultivation of the crops and will return, and she banks on him returning. In other words, her heart pursues his return, right? Her heart pursues his return by preparing for dinner, etc., right? So traditionally, the woman and the children cooked, right? And the man and the older young men would go out to the field, and the younger women would sometimes tend the field as well. But the younger women would also help in the cooking or preparation or the maintenance of the house, whatever. Okay, so the reason why this is so important is because now we go from aim, which would be the proper pronunciation of mother in the ancient pictographic Hebrew. We have a tendency to say the Arabic versions, Abba and Ima, right? But those are later soundings, and so I'm kind of sticking with the purity of it a little bit. But the premise is we're going to go from im, we're going to add the noon, which I don't know if you guys recall, but the noon is the seed sprout, which means what? Continue. As soon as you see, as soon as you see a, as soon as you see a seed sprout, you know the next generation of plants is coming, right? As soon as the seed goes from death to life, we know that the next generation has come. The seed sprout being put in the ground is pursuing that thought that it's going to sprout, right? That's the point behind dropping the seed in the ground, where you're pursuing it, right? Okay, so the premise is now what we have is we have it transitioning from mother to steadfastness based upon the meaning of glue, but also in the meaning of something that stands the test of time, right? Or something that stands up straight. From that, then we get into this idea of faithfulness, in that the woman honors the covenant. That's emunah, okay? Emunah. From there, we're going to transition into something else, and that is going to be the covenant itself. And the covenant itself is spelled like this. This is the Hebrew word emet. Emet, okay? Still contains the mother and the glue, but now contains something else. So let's talk a minute about this something else a little bit, okay? In ancient times, people were, if they were monotheistic and they were walking with God, or they were walking with the monotheistic creator, they're walking with Yahweh, they were nomadic. They were not city-state dwellers. They did not travel in huge, they didn't settle into huge areas and stay there. They would move. And generally speaking, they followed the water because they were desert dwellers. And so if a well dried up, or if there wasn't rain and there was a drought to where there wasn't any growth from the ground or whatever, they would follow the food. So why is this so important? Well, because that nomadic lifestyle and movement equated to having to find spots that were good for camping. However, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that that would be your spot. So usually what would happen is there would be scouts sent to find oases or areas where there was water for the animals, and then they would set up shop. No, they would mark the spot and go back and report it. That marking contained the family banner or Nisi. And it was a banner. There were two sticks driven into the ground in the form of an X. Okay. And there was a banner hung from them. And that said, this is this clan's place where they're going to put their tents. Now, should that land have already been someone else's and it just not be occupied at the moment, one of three things was allowed to happen. And you see this even today in Israel's laws, and you see it even today in the conflict in the Middle East. And that is the idea of squatting. If you were a squatter, so whether you know or not, that's important. But premise is that as you arrive at the place and you sit yourself there, you are squatting on that land. If no one contests it, it's yours. But if someone comes along and contests it, you have one of two things you can do. You can flee, you can attack, or you can enter into covenant. So you could either leave the property, which we see that happen when the Philistines bury the wells that Isaac dug, or that Abraham dug. And so Isaac moves to another spot and digs another well, et cetera, et cetera. But the premise is, and I may have that a little mixed up, but the premise is that he moved. Philistine said, that's ours. He agreed and moved. Okay. But then there's another place where Abimelech wants to enter into covenant with Isaac and saying, I will occupy this spot. I will not encroach upon any other part of your land. And if there is a problem where there is a nation who wants to rise up against us, I will fight beside you because it's my land as well. Covenant was then represented by that same symbol. And so the premise is that covenant is the Tav. Okay? Covenant is the Tav. And so oftentimes we see Tav as being representative of a covenant, in the sense that that was one of the options when the Nisi was put in place. One of the options was to enter into covenant with the surrounding lands in order to avoid that conflict of squatting, right? So you squat, you place your banner, and then people come along and say, no, that's ours. Or maybe people come along and say, hey, join us in case a bigger army comes, and we will be in covenant. Remember, Abraham was in covenant with Honor, Eshcol, and Mamre. Remember, he dwelt by the palms, which means there was an oasis of Mamre, because palms only grow where there's water. So the premise is that, I'm sorry, not the oak tree, rather, only grows where there's water. And so the premise is that we have the oaks of Mamre, we have the covenant going on. And when the king of Sodom says, hey, take all the spoils and I'll take the people, and Abraham's like, nah, you take it all, but give my friends Honor, Eshcol, and Mamre a portion of it because I'm in covenant with them. Okay. And so the premise is that covenant is represented by the letter Tav. Okay. We'll get more into that in a minute, but the premise is got to be understood that the Tav not only represents X marks the spot, like that's where it goes, but also the Tav represents the covenant itself. Okay. And that's going to become important here in a minute. Okay. So now what we need to do is go back into our ancient pictographic Hebrew. So let's do that. So we've got our word emet, and I'm just going to go ahead and move to another screen here and begin to illustrate this. Now remember what the parent root was. The parent root was mother, okay? Remember that. And remember that emet is actually a derivative of emunah. In other words, emet is actually a derivative of the faithfulness to the covenant. So basically now what we have is we have the mother and we have the covenant, okay? The mother or the strong water or the strength of the tent and the covenant. Remember, this is going to be the lead ox. This is going to be water, and this is going to be X marking the spot. Okay. Remember, our parent root is strong water, as in glue. Why'd I do a fat one? We'll just write it that way. Glue. And we have what? We have mother, right? As in the one who holds the tent together. Mother, or Ima, or aim in the ancient. So now what we need to do is ask, what does this word mean? This word means truth. So let's talk about this a minute. Truth is a derivative of faithfulness to a covenant. Truth contains the symbol of covenant and something else. Okay? Truth contains the symbol of a covenant and something else. Well, and then within that, we have that was the result of that was derivative of the word steadfastness, as in something that stays upright and cannot be moved. And then we know that that goes back to the glue that held the goat hair together. Okay. And so now what we have when we're working with truth is we have all of that history behind it. So really, truth is the strong water of the covenant, right? Okay. So the reason why this is important is because I want you to understand that covenant pursues establishment. So when you are established, then you can enter in the covenant. When you squat on the land, that's when you get to enter into covenant. When you tread upon the land, or when you move into the space, that's when you are able to enter into covenant. But truth represents covenant. In fact, truth is synonymous with covenant because why? It's the words of the covenant that you are to bank upon. But now we have a question. Let me put these back over here so I don't lose them. Now we have a question. And that question is, if truth represents covenant and covenant is the Torah, then we know Torah is truth. Then we now find that truth pursues something. Okay. So what does truth pursue? And that's going to be the important one here. But let's go back through this. What does the mother pursue? The mother pursues order within the household, right? But the mother pursues order within the household from the premise or from the idea of there being bones, there being a structure to the tent. What do I mean by that? Well, let's talk about that a minute. If we were to glue, remember this viscous material that never dries, that's important. It had to be flexible, right? So the wind could blow on it. So this glue never dries. It just becomes stronger with its exposition to oxygen. So we have this glue that never dries, and so we have all these pelts, right, that are glued together. And now you want to put them up so you can go underneath them. You can't do it without the father. You can't do it without the bones. You can't do it without the structure of the tent. So the structure of the tent and the motor together form the tent. Why? Because without it, the pellets will flap around, they'll move away from the tent. They will blow away, etc. Plus, it's now waterproof. Now, what's important to know is that this layering that occurs is practiced still today in the Middle East. If there are any Bedouin dwellers left, majority of them have moved into houses, but if there were any tent dwellers left, they were going to be practicing this layering. They've probably stopped using dough. Okay, so the premise is then what we really got to kind of get our minds wrapped around is the idea that these derivatives pursue each other. The Ima or the mother pursues the covenant of the husband by banking on the promises or the truth of the covenant, the dependable part of the covenant, right? And so the premise is that truth itself pursues something. First, we have the covenant pursuing establishment, right? How do we look at that? Well, in its simplicity, when you squat, you're going to encounter something. Somebody who wants you to be an ally, an enemy, something is going to come along and you're going to encounter something as a clan establishing yourself at that point. Covenant is only the result of being established. So now covenant then is pursued by the person who you made the covenant with. They're banking on those promises. It's a marriage covenant, then there is a premise or an idea that there would be an activation of faith by standing upon the promises of that. The woman can trust her husband to not be at home and still be the provider, the protector, and the instructor of the home. Now, the reason why this is important is because when we talk about ancient pictographic Hebrew, we can look at it from two sides. Remember, there's a logos and there's a mythos. We know that this is an evolved language, that it started out in a very pictographic, non-phonic type of language, and that there wasn't a whole lot of words used, but they were more just written, right? And probably possibly some sort of sign language. Moving then forward into phonics, those phonics being assigned to those pictographs. So now the bait has the B sound. And now all of a sudden we're writing, and all of a sudden the Aleph is going from here. Let me show you this really quick. So the Aleph is going from a drawing like this right, to a drawing like this, to a drawing like this, to a drawing like this. And the premise is that all language that we have today is derived from those ancient pictographs, whether it be the Chinese, whether it be the Middle Eastern languages, whether it be the European, the Indo-European languages. So basically the premise then that we can gather from that is going to be that we are working with this ancient language evolving. But then on the other side, we have things like the Kof, that is a condensation of light, right? And that means condense, but it's a drawing of the sun at sunset, right? It's a drawing of the sun dropping behind the Mediterranean. And the premise is day end, right? Or I'm sorry, day begin, because sunset is the beginning of time. Okay. And so the premise is in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew. So the premise is then that we have on the one side, we have intensification, condensation, energy and power and electricity and all this other weird stuff coming out of the letter Kof that they couldn't have known. For example, the word Dam had to do with the systolic and diastolic pressures of the bloodstream, literally means moving water. These are not things that they could have known, right? And so the premise is that not only do we have an evolved language, but we have the intensification of all power in the universe choosing this language to connect with the nation of Israel who existed from the foundations of the earth. Now, before you get the idea that I believe that the nation of Israel, not as we understand it today as this UN sanctioned state, or as we understand it as the place where David ruled, but instead the family of God, and therefore sons of promise, according to Romans chapter 9, we understand that that was determined from the foundation of the earth, but it not necessarily the number and not the choice. And so it was determined that there would be a people. We didn't know how many people, and we didn't know how those people were going to become a people. We just knew that there would be a people and that the rest of the world was determined as a result of that. Okay. But the premise is, when we are dealing with this thought process, we need to look at the concept that the language was divine and the language evolved through human process. What do I mean by that? I mean that these truths are actually laws of the universe. Let me give you an example of a law of the universe. The Hebrew word emet, when you remove the wise leader, which means you remove the instruction, right, away from it, this word is what results. What is that word? What is mem tav? Whoops, tav, mem tav. Mem tav is the word met, which equals death. Which means what? The Aleph is pursuing death to create truth, which are the words of a covenant. You get this? And so the premise is the Aleph always wants to be here. It wants to be present with the Mem and the Tav. And if it is not, there is death, which is winter, which is what? Being pursued by resurrection. Death is being pursued by resurrection and will eventually overtake it. Resurrection will eventually overtake death. So what is truth pursuing? Well, obviously it's pursuing to be part of a covenant. That's a given. But it is also doing something else. What is it doing? It's pursuing deception. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's explain this concept of this idea. What we're really looking at here is a balance, right? So justice is always pursuing mercy. Mercy is always pursuing justice, right? There is that premise that without mercy, justice is tyrannical. But without justice, mercy allows people to get away with things. And so the premise is there needs to be a balance. One is going to always pursue the other. Truth pursues deceit. Deceit pursues truth. But the premise is that we don't have to keep lying because of what we know. Truth will prevail because it's seeking out something. It's seeking a state of covenant, right? Covenant itself is seeking establishment. Establishment is pursuing the scout who's looking for the place, right? It's kind of crazy how this law of pursuit works. But the premise is that everything that is coming is pursuing the other thing and is eventually going to overtake it. So we have the time before it's pursuing. The moment of present, it is overtaken it, and what? The time when it is moving away, and as it's moving away, something else is pursuing it. And that will become the present. The reason this is important is because now you understand truth is actually a mechanism of the universe. Now, we as humans have made truth relative to our circumstances. We have decided that something is true or not true based upon our biases, our own whim and desires, and our social condition. Okay? And then there is absolute truth, which is covenantal truth, which is a creative process. Covenantal truth is actually deriving from the intensification of all power in the universe as something very powerful and intelligence. See, the intensification of all power in the universe is not a person. The intensification of all power in the universe is not a piece of matter, a form. The intensification of all power in the universe is not a concept. It's an existence. And you could look at it very mechanically, that it has one purpose and intention. But here's the intrigue. It is intelligent. And that intelligence is, in its own way, intuition, which is what? A foreseeing of the future based upon a magnetic attraction, which means what? Truth is attracted to those who are truthful, and deceit is attracted to those who are deceitful. Now, the two balance each other out and cancel each other out. Sure, a human isn't just a truthful human. Sorry, that's just not that way. But a deceitful person is someone who has chosen deceit, and therefore deceit overtakes him or pursues him, and truth overtakes a person or pursues them, okay? But now the way that I want you to think about this is in a different aspect, and that's going to be the feminine and masculine principle, because did truth come out of the Abba? Did truth come out of the Av? Provision, protection, instruction come out of the Av, but it's the Ima by which truth is derived, or the mother. Why is that? Well, there's another element of intrigue here. And that is, remember that when we're dealing with the intensification of all power in the universe, we're dealing with the process of forces, right? And all force is a magnitude of energy moving in a specific direction, right? That's the concept here. And so that is a result of intention. So what is the intensification of all power in the universe's intention? Benevolence, right? We've already proven that. We've gone through that Epicurean test, all that stuff. Benevolence. And by benevolence, and the only way in which benevolence can actually manifest as something tangible is through bestowal, a granting or a giving. And so when we look at this, what we're going to find is that there's more purpose in receiving than giving. I know that sounds off the wall, but the premise is that we receive to give. If somebody gives us advice, we receive that advice and carry it out and it works, we usually will pass that advice on to somebody else, right? That's receiving to give in that sense. But let me show you something that is actually very interesting, okay? So let's see, let's do one more screen here. Okay, so let's say that this vast blank screen is the intensification of all power in the universe. And the reason I have to do this is because I have to kind of create a photo negative. What this is a vast or infinite light, okay? But you can't draw a bunch of light and then erase a small circle on the screen. That would take forever. So we're going to do a photo negative of it. And then the next thing that happens is I'm going to create this limitation in the universe. Now, this is a photo negative. So what is this? This is some sort of not intensification of all power in the universe. And that some sort of not is a negation particle, right? So that creates this vessel, right? That does not contain the intensification of all power in the universe, or a void. But that doesn't last very long. That's just a momentary statement of negation, no or not, okay? And then what happens? Through the use of a conduit, which we're not going to get into today, a seed is planted inside of the vessel. That seed that's planted inside of the vessel begins to intensify. Let's change the color for intensity. Let's say we use yellow. So now we have this intensity beginning to occur that's going to go to the limitation and no further, because it cannot be the intensification of all power in the universe, because that is, and this is important, that is just becoming the intensification of all power in the universe. So this dialing back that occurs means there's a reduction in the infinite light. That's the not. Then the seed being planted, excuse me, then the seed being planted is yet another facet of that, right? Because now the seed is there and now it's intensifying. Because the seed itself is from the intensification of all power in the universe. So it's in its nature to intensify, which means what? It's a masculine principle within a feminine principle, because the vessel was a vessel of reception. How do we know? Because it didn't contain a seed, which means what? Which means this feminine process becoming a vessel of reception in order to receive a seed is purpose. Right? The vessel contains a purpose, but this also is purpose. The seed or the masculine principle planted within the feminine principle is purpose as well. Now, here's the intrigue. This continues to happen. Like once the intensification realizes that it has reached its limitation and its only opportunity is to give, then sudden it creates a vessel of reception, and that activates purpose. Now, the reason this is important, because now you see that the feminine pursues the masculine and the masculine pursues the feminine. Now, why is that important and why is that so confusing? Well, in its simplicity, the bestower pursues the receiver pursues reception and therefore receives conception, but the thing that was conceived goes through that same process again. So here's the interesting thing about this. Number one, truth is actually pursuing. Remember, truth is derived from a feminine principle, right? The thing that holds the tent together. The masculine principle holds the tent up, but the feminine principle holds the tent together. Then we know that truth is actually a purpose, right? So in its context, it's not that truth is a purpose, but that purpose is truth. Remember, truth is pursuing. And here's the intrigue. It's not pursuing as in it's just looking at, say, Tina and saying, I'm going to pursue him. Truth is pursuing every single human being. But that's only to activate the purpose within that human being. A purpose that is predetermined from the point of view of the things that have occurred in your life. How do I say predetermined? Because purpose pursued your adversity. Let me explain. The discomfort you went through caused you to move. That movement either created another problem or created a solution. That solution, if it becomes a solution, then becomes what? Something that works, right? Something that works is then what? Given to others, right? Given to others to help them avoid having to go through that part of the adversity. They may go through the adversity itself, similar, but now they don't have to go through figuring it out. They can just follow your model, and as they model you, they can successfully navigate the adversity. But here's the intrigue. When that adversity occurred and you reacted to it, purpose was already pursuing you. And purpose will overtake you if you allow truth to do what truth does, and that is to become the strength of the tent, the strength of provision, protection, and instruction. And so when we are dealing with covenant, we are dealing with words of truth that are dependable, that can be banked upon. The banking upon that is a belief about the purpose. So now let's see if we can bring this all together into something discernible, okay? Something that we can walk away with, and it's simple, and it's not all these different Hebrew words and all this stuff. But I've now proven to you that not only is truth and intelligence and eventually becomes a person, that would be the Torah or the word became flesh and dwelt among us. But truth is actually what created the universe. Without it, there is that element of death, right? But the premise is that also there is an element that it is pursuing deceit. What's the deceit? It's that belief that you're not going to go through the season. You keep telling yourself, I'm not going to go through this. No, you're going to go through it. You just have to figure out how you're going to respond to it. Because if you respond to it in kind with theme, then that kind is going to pursue you. Okay, so how do we say this in a way that we can walk away and say, okay, that's what that means. I understand all the mythical and the esoteric, but let's see if we can't narrow it down. And this is how it works. When you go through something, it becomes something you become stronger in, because that's how our minds work. Brain elasticity proves that. Once you become stronger in it, then you become an expert in it. And if you become an expert in it, then you become a teacher in it. And if you become a teacher in it, then you actually cause others to not have to go through it. Then that becomes your purpose. Purpose pursues you. So here is the important part. What is the actual response that a human being is going to have to their adversity? I never want to talk about or deal with that again. Right? And all these little things trigger me, and all these little things cause me to not want to deal with it, blah, 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 blah. But the truth is that's probably your purpose. So now what you're going to have to do is deal with all these other people who are going to what? To trigger you to want to have a negative response to that information. Meaning what? We are self-deceiving ourselves, or we are producing a false purpose by ignoring the purpose that's actually being given to us, or I'm sorry, not given to us, but is being communicated to us through the adversity. Now, we could get into all kinds of things like, why did the adversity come? Because that adversity, of course, seems to be deterministic, but at the same time, some person or some event occurred that was either a choice or was an anomaly. But the premise is that a majority of the time it's choice. Somebody chose to abuse you. Somebody chose to treat you that way. Somebody chose to say those words to you. That's your adversity. That becomes your strength and therefore your purpose. And that means that your purpose was pursuing you when that person chose to do that. I don't want any trouble. But now you see that you have to step into your purpose, because then they keep pursuing. Now, is this irresistible grace? No, that's not where I'm going with this. What I'm saying is it will continue to assert itself. It will continue to pursue you. It will continue to bring itself up. And that's the point of this entire message, is that your purpose pursues you because it's truth. Because somewhere in there, it's based upon a covenantal relationship that occurred at the foundations of the world. And furthermore, not only was it at the foundation of the world, but the premise is that it was already somehow a theme of a season. You went through lack and decrease during the reaping season of the wilderness season. And so what you need to understand from that is if that's true, your reaction to it may have created wounds in others, or perhaps maybe even embittered you. And so as a result of that, then you actually were not necessarily overcoming it. But when you actually respond to it with strength, which eventually we all do. See, that's the part where I'm saying there's a deterministic element here, in that the creator, the intensification of all power in the universe, who created your brain, knows that your brain will eventually be strong in it. And then you become an expert in it. And then you become a teacher in it. And then you have purpose. And when you have purpose and you step into your purpose, guess what you become? a master of that thing. So you go from simple adversity that you don't completely understand, that is actually a season pursuing you, to master of that thing. So that is the important part of this thing. Remember that it takes both the mother and the father to create the tent. And so in that system of understanding, please understand, I'm not saying paternal and maternal influences, because there's a protective figure and there is a nurturing figure that creates those processes. The nurturing figure is a feminine process. The protecting figure is a masculine process, but that doesn't necessarily equate to gender, because I know some of you single moms out there are going, oh man, I'm screwed, right? But the premise is that there's probably a protecting figure somewhere in your equation, okay? Or if it's a single father, there is a nurturing figure somewhere in your equation. You just have to identify it and invest in it, okay? So last thing that I want you to think about is, if you choose to not pursue, interesting word, right? Your purpose that's pursuing you, kind of sounds like something biting its tail, then you will create a space or a void where something else will come in and be that purpose. Okay. What does that mean? That means that there's kind of this idea that if you don't do it, somebody else will, but also there's this idea that there cannot be a void. Form and order pursue voids and disorder. Okay. So there is a little bit of intrigue within this word that I would like to share with you really quick. Going back to our word emet, and that is each individual letter has a representation of a process. For example, this is actually two oxes, right? A lead ox and a not lead ox, right? Which one is stronger? The younger one is stronger, but the lead ox has the wisdom on the way that it's supposed to go, which means represented within truth is actually mentorship, leadership, right? Represented within truth is that there is a greater and lesser in every covenant. Someone is stronger than somebody else in every covenant, okay? And then the next one we have is the mem. And what's interesting about that is that's water, but in the Hebrew, if I attach a mem here, that means who. Me is who in Hebrew, me, okay? That's a mem yod, it's pronounced me, and it means who. But here's the intrigue, is that it doesn't actually mean that. What it means is question mark, as in the unknown, or the whole idea of looking out into the sea and not knowing what's going on. And then the yod, which is what? Work. So then it's like, what work was done? Okay. Or who is the doer, right? Then there's ma, which is the mem he, which is what is the existence, or what is the witness? What do we see? So what do we do and what do we see? This is the Hebrew word for what? But again, that's not English. We can't depend on the English here. So we have me and we have ma, right? So think of it more that they are questions and not necessarily interrogatory words like in English. Okay, so that's just a little treat on that. And then we already kind of went over the idea that that's covenant, that means name, it means mark, right, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so for those of you who are on YouTube, I will say Shabbat Shalom. And for those of you who are staying, I'll need a few minutes to set up for Midrash.